There we go. Well, hello, everybody. I know almost everybody, but not everybody. And plus, we've got folks who will be joining us asynchronously watching the recording. So I will introduce myself. I'm Mel Hauser. I use she, they pronouns, and I am executive director here at All Brains Belong Vermont. And we are very excited. And like I'm a little bit stressed. I'm not gonna lie, because this is gonna be like this is gonna be a very important and tough conversation. It's the COVID conversation. And what we've been doing at Brain Club this month. By the way, actually, let me just by way of introduction, if you would like to access closed captioning, and if they're not popping up automatically, you can try clicking either the live transcript CC, or if your version of Zoom doesn't have that one, you can click more ... and choose show subtitles. And if they are popping up automatically and you don't want them to, you can do the same strategy to choose hide subtitles. All right, so by way of ground rules for those who've not been to a Brain Club before, all forms of participation are okay here. You can have your video on or off. Even if you're a presenter, you can have your video off whenever you want. We even if your video is on, we definitely do not need you to be like looking at the camera or whatever. We in fact actively discourage compliance with any kind of like one right way to be a person type implications. So please walk, move, fidget, snack, stim, eat, all the things. And you can communicate however you're more comfortable. You can unmute and use mouth words. You can type in the chat box. You can gesture, whatever works for you. Safety is important to us always. And in particular today, when we are going to be talking about a loaded topic for many people. And just as we talk about before at the beginning of every Brain Club about just if there's something that you personally experienced as traumatic or distressing, we ask that you give a content warning about the topic so that others can listen with informed consent. And because pretty much everything I'm going to be talking about today, I experience as distressing, I'm going to give you my content warnings. We're going to be talking about COVID, long COVID, ableism, exclusion, health inequity, premature death, stroke, suicide, and dementia. So I want everyone to just know that this is a heavy topic today. And for months now, our Brain Club regulars have been on a journey of unlearning and reimagining, thinking about the assumptions, the defaults that are embedded in society, the things that we think are the way it needs to be, but they're not laws of physics. And we've been like giving ourselves permission to shift the brain rules that are not world rules and are no longer serving us. And it's a world rule that when you call people on their brain rules, they flip their lids. So there's brain science for this. It's automatic and involuntary. When we talk about things that are uncomfortable, our limbic systems are going to respond. And while this may look different for different people in different contexts, I like to, I use a particular cognitive strategy for self-regulation to remember the long game, that the vision of inclusion where everybody feels that they belong requires this conversation. And in fact, this Brain Club topic came at the request of the All Brains Belong Community Advisory Council. We have a community advisory board that informs all of our programs and helps set the priorities for how we spend our resources and of energy and bandwidth. And at our last meeting, our community advisory board said the COVID conversation needs to be had. As many of you know, the neurodivergent community is at increased risk of complications from COVID, including long COVID. And since safety is the first step of inclusion. There are lots of factors that impact inclusion, but safety comes first. And so, because safety is a prerequisite for inclusion, that's why we're taking on this hard conversation today. Before I introduce us to our community panel, I'm going to share just some introductory thoughts about why I think the COVID conversation is so hard for many people. So, what doesn't work when you have difficult conversations is when people have their identity challenged, because when someone confronts our identity, oops, go back. No, hold on. Yeah, it's a threat. So, as our co-chair of our board of directors, Matt Mulligan, is a mental health therapist, says that people connect their identity to ideas and beliefs often, and so when public health education or other forms of advocacy are received as a threat to identity, that conversation doesn't go anywhere. And remembering that we all make brain rules. Brain rules are cognitive self-regulation strategies. They are the things our brain constructs to keep us safe. And so when a public health message or advocacy strategy confronts a brain rule, many times that will lead to people feeling unsafe, and their limbic systems, our limbic systems, often do not allow us to engage with conversations when our safety establishing strategies are confronted. So, examples of that as it relates to COVID. When I say to someone, COVID's not over, I'm correct. However, if the person has made themselves feel safe through the lens of the opposite of that, that's not gonna land. If someone says, COVID is disproportionately impacting the neurodivergent community, that's true. However, if someone doesn't know that that's relevant to them, though we would like to believe that our society prioritizes equity, like when viewed through the lens of who gets to show up, if there are spaces that are not safe for all people to show up, that's not equitable. And I think we see in our day-to-day life that message seems not to be shifting the norm. So that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about new information. Did you know that the more times you get COVID, the higher your risk of long COVID? That's new information. I would imagine that maybe not everyone knows that. So that's a message that I like to share a lot. That is new research within the past couple of months published that Sometimes when I deliver that information, I'm not violating a brain rule because there was no brain rule created that was the opposite of it. Did you know that long COVID increases the risk of dementia? I'm going to play a video. Oh, I have to stop. I have to stop and reshare with the sound, which I never remember. Where's my video? Here we go.
Inflammation in the brain can cause dysregulation of a number of different cell types and have lasting consequences to cognitive function. Understanding that when the pandemic struck and we saw how profoundly immunogenic, how profoundly inflammatory, even relatively mild cases of COVID could be, I really worried about a neurological health crisis. And I think we're watching that unfold right now. The rates of persistent cognitive symptoms in people who have recovered from COVID is frankly alarming. We need to understand how to intervene and offer effective therapy, or there are going to be just millions of people suffering with these persistent cognitive symptoms. I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a virologist, I'm a neurologist, but I am alarmed by the neurological possible consequences of this pandemic and alarmed by the neurological disease that's already evident in many, many, many survivors of COVID. Even from early in the pandemic, it was very clear to neurologists that COVID infection results in a remarkably high rate of persistent neurological symptoms, including quite a high rate of persistent cognitive symptoms that includes things like difficulty paying attention, difficulty with the speed of information processing, difficulty with concentration and memory. And that is something that we should all be paying a lot of attention to. That is really, really concerning. It's debilitating. People are just not returning to their previous level of function. And that's a major problem with 265 million people worldwide infected with COVID, and some estimates of as many as 1 in 4 people, at least prior to the time of vaccination, experiencing these cognitive symptoms. This is a neurological health crisis. I'm a neuro-oncologist.
All right. So with recent information, a study published in the British Medical Journal just last month, looking at those with long COVID, with higher risk of movement disorders, memory problems, strokes, seizures within the first year, and that another study showing that the neurologic damage from COVID is still present 2 years in since onset of infection. So this is going beyond the infection itself. And so even those with mild or even asymptomatic acute infections are going on to have incredible disability. And it's estimated that there's a study by the Brooks Institute that there's 4 million people in the US who are out of work because of long COVID, including previously healthy people. And unfortunately, this group, just this past February, from the British Medical Journal, describing that 50% of long COVID patients experiencing suicidal ideation. So this is huge. And when we think about the neuroinflammation, the inflammatory changes, the microclots in the blood vessels to the brain. This is yeah. Thank you for the question in the chat defining long COVID. Yes, I'm defining as long-term effects oops. Yep, I haven't reshared slides. Thank you, Ashley. Just answering a question in the chat. Yeah, that's okay. Thank you. Yeah, extending beyond the first few months. So this is long-term impact. But I will go back. I think I have another slide or two before I introduce our panelists. Okay, yeah, I have one more slide. Oops. Oh, come on. All the clicking. So again, like I said, even if someone has mild symptoms of their acute infection or no symptoms at all, 1 in 5 people who gets COVID, all comers, 1 in 5 people who get COVID go on to have long-term effect. And for people who belong to certain groups with additional risk factors, they are at even higher risk than that. So the problem is that many people are at increased risk of long COVID who don't actually know it. So the neurodivergent community, for example, autistic, ADHD folks with autoimmune conditions, or who are at risk of autoimmune conditions. And for many people, it is COVID that kicks off their autoimmune disease. Let's say, for example, they have a family history of autoimmune disease. Or maybe they had some vague, non-specific symptoms that were kind of smoldering along, puberty, then they get a head injury, and so infection, concussion, surgery, pregnancy. There's all kinds of known risk factors that kick off autoimmune disease, but this kind of stepwise progression. And then this is the threshold for that. And so and I'll take Laura's question in the chat about this. I think this is an impossible question, Laura says, but how do we reconcile the disconnect between knowledge and managing anxiety? Well, you're really describing what the problem is in my mind. So managing anxiety, how do many people do that? They latch on to the messages that make us feel safe. I think we all do that. And so when you come along with a message that violates that thing, that makes your world make sense, makes you feel like you're going to be safe, no, I'm going to resist that. So I think that is the perfect time for me to introduce our community panel who are going to help us in community brain solving, because I don't think there are any right or correct answers to how to navigate the brain rule, world rule thing. Because we know what the science tells us. We know what the risks are. We also know how to reduce those risks, namely vaccination, masking, ventilation, filtration, all these things that we know about. And these messages are not landing everywhere, right? So anyway, with that, I'm going to introduce our panel. So what I'm going to do is maybe I'm going to just like maybe if I introduce you all as a group, maybe just wave, and then you can decide who wants to talk in what order. We didn't really give any structure. All right, so I'm so grateful to all of you for being here. So Anne Sosin is a policy fellow from the Rockefeller Institute for Public Policy and Social Sciences at Dartmouth. Kate LaRose is here with a community health background, but as she says, all of her previous professional experience pales in comparison to the insight that she's gained while trying to preserve her medically high-risk child's access to education, as well as both her child and husband's access to healthcare and community. And we're also joined by Beth Regal and Ashley McCormick from the Brain Injury Alliance of Vermont. So yeah, Beth, you want to go first? Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. Can you? Yeah, okay. I'm traveling to our conference. I'm heading for tomorrow. So one of the things I really like to think about with changing the conversation is really remembering like how to focus on still talking about it, and how that so many people feel like they can't bring it up anymore because of judgment, or there's so many brain stories, right? Or so many stories about how the rules of how we're navigating this, but that discounts everybody's experiences that they're experiencing with long COVID and how it's affect already underlying conditions. And those many people, myself and myself included, when you have a long-term health condition, you tend not to talk about it as much because there's stigma. And then when we have long COVID on top of that and COVID symptoms that continue, when we don't talk about these symptoms and we don't share with others, I think it creates more brain rules, or there's other, it never breaks through, is what I'm trying to say. And so in order to decrease the stigma and to get people to open up their minds to understanding along with the science, right, of what we're now seeing, so that, yeah, oh yeah, my friend or my family member or myself, and the more that we talk about it, the better we can start changing that in everyone's minds. So
thank you, Beth. Right, I think transparency is the way out of chaos. Kate, you want to speak next? I saw your video pop on.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that video. And as I watched that and just was listening to Elizabeth speak just now, I often start with my why is my medically vulnerable kiddo and my husband. And also just watching that video and hearing Elizabeth speak, I realized another why is just my experience as well. So I had a TBI 3 years ago. And that first year of recovery was one of the most challenging of my life. And as I experienced the many neuroinflammatory and executive functioning issues that we're seeing now with long COVID. And so this concept of brain fog, I think it's just such a cute term, right? Like it really sounds quite benign. And then I really start thinking about what it was like when I was fighting through the multiple weekly sessions of speech language pathology and occupational therapy and physical therapy. And I just don't think it's possible to begin to understand, like, unless you've been through something similar, just how much you and your loved ones don't want to experience this. So just wanted to share that as well. Like, oh yeah, my why is actually also my experience as well. So this morning I woke up, I have a cat on my head. This morning I woke up and found myself thinking about what I wanted to share today in terms of working together towards a solution. So I navigated over to the Vermont Department of Health website, and I wanted to start by sharing these direct quotes. These are direct quotes from the VDH website. Aerosols are what's exhaled or breathed out. It's dangerous for all people. There is no safe amount. Opening a window or using a fan or air filter system does not get rid of it. There is no way to avoid breathing it when in an enclosed space like a car. At the Department of Health, we're working with statewide partners, healthcare providers, and lawmakers to reduce harm and provide access to clean air. So unfortunately, this isn't about protecting people from COVID, it's about secondhand smoke. I worked in statewide tobacco prevention for 7 years. During that time, I witnessed advocates come together with leaders in education, public health, and the legislature to ensure that people, especially the most vulnerable, had the right to not be exposed to tobacco smoke at schools, childcare settings, workplaces, university campuses, pharmacies, healthcare settings, and even in private cars and businesses. Tens of millions of dollars were spent on effective health messaging, education, access to mitigation and prevention tools, and passing universal policies that support behavior change while simultaneously centering and protecting populations that suffer disproportionate harm. The statewide program prided itself on addressing the needs of disparity populations, investing in evidence-based approaches, and providing clear and consistent public health messaging, all of which was accountable through ongoing rigorous independent evaluation efforts and using a results-based accountability framework that continually asked if Vermonters were better off as a result of these efforts. 2.5 years into the pandemic, we are starting to learn more about the full range of risks and dangers that COVID causes, especially to medically vulnerable populations. And echoing the Vermont Department of Health website, we know that it's airborne and spread through aerosols that can stay in the air for hours. It's dangerous for all people. There is no safe amount of COVID exposure. Opening a window or using a fan or air filter system does not get rid of it, and there's no way to avoid breathing it in when in an enclosed space. But unlike secondhand smoke, the dangers of COVID can be more immediate and long-lasting with just one breath. I'd like to get to a place where leadership in public health, education, and the legislature are willing to provide similar investment and response in protecting kids and families from COVID as they are secondhand smoke. Public health messaging, policies, and state-funded interventions were informed by current science and research. Key target demographics through the years included youth, parents, grandparents, and pet owners, as well as groups experiencing health disparities. They found time and again that empowering youth to advocate to protect themselves and others was effective, as were emotional appeals to family members on the dangers and risks their loved ones could experience. And in some cases, especially for tweens and teens and for parents, communications that provided graphic depictions of consequences of exposure were especially effective. Though secondhand smoke protections took over 100 years to get here, as remember that we initially started from a place where doctors were recommending smoking to people and even to mothers for its health benefits. We're finally at a place of nearly universally acknowledging and putting into place protections so that people, and especially children, should be protected from unhealthy air. So my wonderment at the moment is this: how might we apply the lessons learned, policy successes, infrastructure, and cultural norms built around secondhand smoke exposure to protecting kids from COVID? I'm really looking forward to the rest of the evening's conversation and hearing and reading people's thoughts. Thank you.
That is fascinating. So when we think about, like, in my lifetime, I don't have any memory of any other time when there'd be like such clear like science and then like policy and messaging that doesn't match it. And it's interesting because I did not grow up in a time when doctors talked about it being safe to smoke. So I knew that's true. I know that's true. It's like the history I know, but that's very interesting to say there actually maybe is a precedent for how that process gets navigated, because yeah, the community conversation around the harms of secondhand smoke. It goes differently in 2022 than conversations around COVID, doesn't it? Anne, do you feel like chiming in?
Hi, everyone. Let me maybe add a few thoughts to that, building on what Kate has said. So I've been thinking a lot about the ways that we are individualizing societal failures and trying to shift from thinking about policy choices to putting the burden on individuals to make choices about their health, and often we're displacing both risk and responsibility, and that falls, when we do that, that falls heaviest on the most vulnerable members of our communities. That's how we generate inequities. And so, while I haven't thought about it from the vantage point of tobacco control, which is a really good example, I have thought about it a lot in the context of this pandemic, how there's a lot of narratives that uphold this shift in responsibility, and I'm really interested in thinking through how do we change that? How do we make it clear that these are actually policy choices? And when we shift from thinking of we shift from making policy choices to pushing blame onto individual, or pushing to this, embracing this personal responsibility narrative. What does that mean? What does that mean? And how can we change that? So a bit of a meandering comment to Kate's really eloquent one, but that's my starting thought on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are lots of examples where we don't shift the burden to personal responsibility. Like, we don't say, oh, well, you can become intoxicated and drive a car. Like, there's lots of examples where that, and I think, for me, as someone who belongs to a group of people who is at high risk of complications from COVID, with a child who's at high risk of complications from COVID, I have a lot of privilege that I can work while controlling most of my exposures. And when we think about, also through an equity lens, that is not everyone's experience. So it's personal responsibility without, one, informed consent of who may or may not be at increased risk, and two, the equity piece of not only who gets to show up places, but who has to show up places that they don't actually have control over negotiating that safety. So all of those layers. Ashley.
Hi, yeah. I realize I messaged the whole group and not you directly, but yeah, I guess to add to the conversation, I have a family member who has an autoimmune disease, and so for me, COVID has always been, a big deal, as it should be, and I think it is really frustrating for those of us who have family members or friends who are saying, "Oh, I got it. I was fine. I had it, and it was 2 days long, and I didn't even have symptoms and everything." And so I think it's hard not to be frustrated by that, and to realize, and I mean, you have to realize that the reason why people say those things is because maybe they're thinking of or they're thinking about messaging that they've heard from the media or from people in politics, people in power. So it's really important to remind yourself of that, and I guess just to look into the actual statistics and what medical providers are saying, and to urge your family members, this is what medical providers are saying, and this is what researchers are saying. And it's very real, and it's very real for a lot of people who have autoimmune diseases and who have co-occurring disorders and mental health disorders. So I do think it's a lot of, stepping up and educating your peers and your family. And, if they're not going to take that into account and challenge their previous way of thought, then that's not on you, it's on them. And not to, I guess, absorb that burden is important, but it's hard. It is.
David adds, thank you, Ashley. And yes, and I think that, I think much like Beth said, about just like, naming the thing and telling those stories are really important. So in the chat, David says, I wonder if it will take the economic impact of long COVID on employment to shift the conversation. Let's come back to that, because I think you're right. I think you are. Becky adds, informed consent. I used this phrase to talk about COVID risk in a workplace, and I received pushback saying that it was patronizing. I think people decide to ignore the risks and would rather not pay attention to how it could have an impact on their entire life. We need to keep advocating and educating, right? It's so hard. It's like oh, you share this content and you are fear mongering. A family member today, when I declined to have an indoor visit from a group of people, like, you're obsessed. I'm worried about you. You're obsessed about COVID. I'm like, no, I'm just like actually aware of my own safety, and I'm like, I have access needs for safety. That's all. I'm not stressed out about it. I'm actually just like not having you in my house. Like, it's just this is what goes on, because I think people, all the brain rules. And Laura Ad said, it feels like we're forcing people to disclose health information right now. Kate and I were on another call together, and a parent shared that in order to access safe education, access to public education, there was like the requirement of disclosing all kinds of stuff. And I think, and that's part of the bigger conversation around access for people with all kinds of disabilities, that disclosing personal information is often required before accommodations are made. It's a bigger picture problem. I'm wondering if anyone has had any successes in navigating these conversations. I think sometimes it's not about having, that I'm right and the other person's wrong. It's more about like, Sierra and I, we were at a meeting with a community partner earlier today, and not talking about COVID even, but just the remark that, like, if the goal is just to invite curiosity, that of like, being willing to, like, oh, there's a little bit of dissonance between the way I'm seeing the world and what this person has just said to me. And I wonder if anyone's had any successes.
I've had successes in terms of not around COVID, but around other topics, particularly around people who are the opposite political view. I will come at them more with curiosity. And once they realize I kind of respect them, they tend to open up and be more open to a conversation. So I don't know how that would apply to COVID, but.
Oh, yeah, so seeking to understand. I remember in early COVID times, when people had all kinds of views about mask or vaccination or whatever, I I would often have the cognitive space to like tell me more about that, and I would learn a whole lot that I think was very worthwhile to be seeking to understand, because it like certainly just doesn't work to just like Mia.
Yeah, I had an experience a few weeks ago. I was at a local restaurant and I wore a mask and nobody else in the restaurant seemed to be wearing one. And somebody just looked me up and down as if I was some alien. And at first I didn't know what he was on about. And then he says to me, "You're not going to get COVID, don't worry about it." And I mean, for me, because I was subjected to a hate campaign for years, that felt like nothing. And it's almost like because of the hate campaign I got on that other issue, it's like I've become immune to sort of that. And I suppose in fairness, this isn't such an emotive topic as the issue I was abused on before. But yeah. But I think one thing I did think is what concerned me would be if he'd speak to someone more vulnerable like that, or someone who could yeah.
Thank you for saying that, Mia. I think that is really important. I have this conversation with patients all day. I'm so anxious. All the people are just doing the thing, and I'm so anxious. Help me with my anxiety. And I'm like, okay, so again, seek to understand. But often this is about you actually are aware of risks. These are rational appraisals you're making. And when you look around and you wonder, like, am I being rational? Like, it looks like no one else is like being impacted by this information. That is what causes a lot of trouble. Like, so I didn't say this in my introduction, and I should have. 70% of our practice here at All Brains Belong has long COVID or long COVID-like conditions. We're a tiny little startup nonprofit. We have almost 200 people of our local community with long COVID or long COVID-like conditions. This is a ton of people. And I can't tell you how many people are like, but I just, it just seemed like it just when you don't trust your own intuition because of all the messages that say that there's something wrong with you for listening to your limbic system, it's just so hard. Vicky.
Hey, thanks. I don't know if I've made this very coherent in my mind yet, but I'm just really resonating with what you're saying. And I've had a difficult experience. I think a lot of people are sharing of being a parent right now with kids in school. Last year, my kids' school, the school district said they're no longer notifying people when someone in the school has COVID, because they said you should just assume that you're a close contact, that your children are, and that you are by being a contact to them, which makes it really hard when forms say, have you been in close contact with someone with COVID? I'm like, well, apparently everyone is now. But then this year, no, that was about the same time everyone stopped wearing masks. So the schools are not doing masks where I'm at, but my son's entire high school, shut down for half a day. U32, it's like 950 people because so many of the staff were sick. They couldn't staff school, and Montpelier High shut down for an entire day because so many of the staff were sick. They couldn't staff school. And a lot of people like me, I don't have the option of homeschooling my kids because I share custody. So you have to kind of work, or people who are, at work all day. There's a lot of people who can't just drop everything and do schooling with their kids, and they'll, so it's kind of walking that line as a parent where the risks are unacceptable. Your kids still have to live their lives. How do you balance knowing what the risks are with living in the reality of being in a society where there is so much risk? I guess. I guess that's the best I can do is kind of like, how do you navigate this? So thanks.
Thank you for sharing that, Vicki. I think, I there's so many layers, like so many types of privilege that come into this. And so like, yeah, it is reducing your risk. Like having the ability to do that is a huge privilege.
So I'm someone who, for a living, I manage risk for a lot of different people. And I am someone who, I didn't know that I was at square high risk for long COVID, but when I got COVID in March, I ended up with long COVID. So I had 2 months in bed and, again, privilege there. But how I manage the risks, my kids are in school, my kids are also at high risk for complications. Some of it for me is accepting that what the outcomes are, even if they're not the outcomes that I want, are ones that I can learn to live with. And that was a hard learned lesson for me. My 2 months in bed were really, really difficult, but what I was able to do through that and getting, now I'm not at all to the other side. Here I am sitting in bed on, at dinner time on a Tuesday night. But it was, okay, we as humans are adaptable. We have this internalized ableism that we shouldn't get long COVID. Long COVID is really hard to manage. And I've got actually a pretty easy case of long COVID as far as it goes. But it's also something that is part of the illness, is part of the human condition. And so if we are living in fear of these outcomes and that therefore not living our lives, I don't know, Mel, I'm feeling like I'm starting to ramble here a little bit, but jump in.
Well, much like when Kate was speaking and I was saying like, oh, wow, like using this paradigm of what went on with tobacco, I really like the idea of thinking about this other kind of risk mitigation where since I've read part of a book that you've recommended to me to read, so if I'm a person who makes all of my decisions based on what I can live with, and because of my personal experience, I can't live with what I'm seeing all day, like in a non-health way, that would result in people being fairly conservative. And like, that would be okay. They would just make decisions that are conservative. And their decisions may not impact other people the way that maybe, some health decisions don't impact other people, some do. So like maybe what you're inviting me to think about is there an approach to COVID where if people are all like bent on the track of individual decision making, and like making decisions that you can live with, and the risk benefit thing that many people think about for all kinds of things. Like maybe we think about what are the decisions that don't impact other people. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, one thing I think about a lot is how, we have kind of a mirage of agency or choice around a lot of these decisions, that our health is influenced only by our own choices and that we can control everything. And in reality, a lot of what we see is constrained choices. We're not choosing the places where we send our kids to school, where we work, the essential places we need to go, and what happens in terms of what's there. And so a lot of inequities are created by those differences in terms of choice. Some of us are able to work from home. We were very protected, while others, essential workers were out there long before vaccines became available. Now, we're in a really different era. We have vaccines, we have other protections, but some people still remain at really high risk. And, and even the uneven outcomes we continue to see are really structured more by lack of choice than they are by real choices. We like to, individualize those societal failures. We haven't made the places we need to be safer. And so sometimes we individualize, and then we also, and I would connect this back to the earlier comment, we want to kind of transform a legitimate concern into anxiety, or pathologize that as a way of kind of deflecting responsibility. You're anxious, you're I've heard crazy, we've heard every label attached to that. And that's part of, I think that's a part of pushing away responsibility. So let me stop there.
And I think as Laura adds, it's not just about your own decisions, but you make decisions, and then like the whole network of people. It's kind of like in early COVID with the idea of like pods of the COVID bubble. Like it was a privilege to be able to define a bubble where everyone in the bubble got to make choices, as opposed to not like as Anne said, the lack of choice. But I think it's interesting. Like if we've got about 5 minutes left today, and since this has come up a few times about the responses to other people, when people do share their story, like the thing I do have control over is like maybe what comes out of my mouth a little bit. I might have to cortically override to like keep it there. But like if someone says to me, you're too anxious, you're too this, like that is like independent harm over and above COVID, right? Like maybe I will try not to do that, Anyway, Sarah. Can you unmute? Oops. Can't hear you. Might be a sound thing. You want to type in the chat? I don't think that they are muted. I think that their sound might be off. I think they're reconnecting to audio, it looks like. Laura, you want to say something while we're waiting?
Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit with so my mom has Parkinson's, and has a lot of anxiety to start, and Parkinson's has made that worse, and COVID has sort of been like the focus of anxiety. And one of the challenges that I faced as her daughter is that she has stopped doing a lot of the things that were really helpful to her.
You cut out, but what I'm hearing you say,
Parkinson's
yeah, there you go.
were fear of COVID.
I can't tell if it's my internet or Laura's,
And
but I think what you're saying is
Laura's.
that
I think it's
okay.
Laura's because I
Okay.
have the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, what I was hearing is that that when someone is avoiding things that were helpful, my advice would be to identify things that are helpful that are still within their own, their own safety parameters. Sarah, did your audio get figured out?
Can you hear me? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What an awesome thing. So, two thoughts if I can pull them together. One is that both from my kind of analogous in the mental health world, looking at when people changed, like nobody got bipolar disorder until they'd invented a medication that could fix it, or that they thought would fix it. And then all of a sudden, as soon as there was a fix, then everybody jumped on the bandwagon. And the point and I've seen that a couple of other times. And the point for me seems like when you have a really difficult, insoluble problem, like this feels like an insoluble problem. Like everybody wants to be together and people are desperate to be together, but we can't breathe the same damn air. And so people are just in denial about that problem, and nobody talks about it because it's so big until there's like a doable fix. And so I think that the challenge is going to be coming up with like some kind of practical fix that we don't end up having to that the general public is just my worry is that we're just going to keep being in denial because people want to be together so much. Anyway, that's the one part of it. And the other thing that seems like is that one of the reasons I think it's so easy to get written off as crazy is because literally the definition of crazy that's in the DSM is when your opinion or actions differ significantly from that of your culture. So that's the definition, that's the standard of crazy that's been promulgated. And so anytime we're doing something different from our culture, it's like that's how you get written off as crazy, is you do something different it doesn't matter if you're right. It matters if you do something different from everybody else that annoys them.
And I think related to just thinking about like societal or cultural norms that a couple people have in the chat about is connecting ableism, internalized ableism. Ableism stems from capitalism, or I'm just reading from the chat, national focus on productivity above all else. Someone else adds, and that this ongoing situation mostly due to systems in place such as capitalism. Wealthy people in power will be fine if they get COVID due to therapies they have direct access to, et cetera. And so thinking about, I think thinking about both Sarah's point about like significant departure from the majority of people, and that the majority of people are being influenced by broader systems that many people like can recognize in some contexts and not other contexts, and like thinking about how that plays out and how I think that I'm reading through the chat and trying to talk as fast as I'm reading and not not keeping up with it. So I think Vicky's point is, I think, a great one to end on, which is that a push to normalize risk mitigation strategies. So it's not a solution, but gives people an alternative to a complete denial of the risk. So for example, really looking at, there's all kinds of literature on the efficacy of air filtration, or even short of like big picture, like huge expensive interventions aimed at both ventilation and filtration, but like small scale interventions that are shown to be effective. Mia?
Yeah, just what Sarah was saying about being crazy reminded me, and I think that in the in the program, I think you were saying that you're going to speak about exclusion. About how, yeah, I think one thing is that with regards to seeing family, I think for me, actually, contrary to a lot of other people, and I recognize that I have privilege in this, is that I feel that COVID has been mainly positive for me just because I've been socially isolated all my life. And COVID, I think, has made a lot of people question the status quo, and it's put people online and brought people together. But I mean, for me, regarding people wanting to see their relatives, as I say, as I've said before, I've been cut off from a relative abroad for the last 10 years of her life because I've not been able to fly to see her because of an ableist airport security policy. But one thing I found myself thinking is that people were saying that, oh, I'm not going to be able to see my relatives for months. And normally I think I'd be sympathetic, and I was to individuals who don't subscribe, who didn't contribute to keeping me down. But I found myself thinking what I would give to be able to see my relative in just a few months. So I remember one of the people who judged me over the years was speaking about how they had to see say goodbye to their elderly great aunt from a ladder, like outside the window, and I found myself thinking what I would give to have that. But yeah, but like, I think what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people, and also people would say to me over the years, you need to give up freedom for liberty, for security. But now the tables are turned, and like people are suddenly talking about civil liberties. But I think what I realize is that people don't care about civil liberties until it is theirs at stake, almost. Yeah. So I know I might have put that in a very haphazard way, but yeah.
No, I think the way I really appreciate you sharing that, and you're getting thanked in the chat also, because I think that, and then I am going to wrap us up, but as the parent of a young child, I think about like how do I teach the message of we are all going to be, I'm trying to find an alternative word, since I know this word has the impact that I'm going to say that I'm trying not to have. Our limbic systems respond to different things. and like teaching our kids that part of being an engaged, connected citizen of the world is recognizing that like what sets off your limbic system is different than what sets off that person's limbic system. And I think in the COVID conversation, I think that many people, even if we take civil liberty out of the equation, there are people who don't know that this is distressing a whole bunch of people, and that there are a whole bunch of people that don't feel safe going to school and don't feel safe going to the grocery store and don't feel safe, et cetera, because really, we don't get to decide what makes us feel safe. Our limbic systems just decide. And honestly, it's part of my own privilege that it has only been since now being physically marginalized and not being able to access so many of the default places in society. And for me to actually get to a point, even as an autistic person, it has only taken now that I am filled with rage, limbic rage. And I think that there are, like, when I learn that someone else is filled with limbic rage related to something I say and do, I take that and I try to learn from it. And I think this is just the missing piece of developing an inclusive society, that we are just looking out to have people feel safe and that they get to show up and feel that they belong. I still don't know really how to do that, but we'll keep talking.
Well, and I love that you frame the vision that way. And I think this, I love that you frame the issue in terms of that's the vision.
And I think so much of it is just sharing these things that not a lot of people know, you know, that you talked about in the beginning on the slides. A lot of people don't realize this information. So continuing to share that.
Oh, I have to share Vicky's comment. I think our society equates calmness with rationality. Yeah, you can be rational and not calm. Wow. Whoa. And Becky shares the vision that everyone feels safe and everyone feels they belong. Yeah. So I look forward to continuing to work with all of you and in all the circles we all work in to try to make it so. Bye, everybody. We'll see you next week to talk about neurodiversity and employment.